Another comment, and this is actually an interesting one, and I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the history behind this. This isn't a anti-Semitic comment, but it's a comment based off of a misconception of history that I find actually crucial to go over. So this comment says as follows. It's crazy to see how Zionist scholars have scrambled to rewrite history when it comes to Jews living under Islamic rule. Jews were able to live freely and able to practice their religion without discrimination because they were considered to be people of the book. When Muslims conquered Jerusalem, notice there were no Jews left in the area because of the Christian Crusades. So once they conquered, they welcomed and encouraged many Jews to move back to the area. Plus, dhimmi status was not something humiliating. Dhimmi status meant that they were a protected class living under the Ottoman Empire that were not required to join military forces, but had to pay a tax instead. And this tax, taxes in quotations for those not on YouTube, was significantly lower than taxes that Muslims under the same rule were required to pay to the empire. The treatment of Jews under Christian rule and Islamic rule was a night and day difference. It's pretty dishonest to say that their quality of life was debatable. So a couple of interesting things, some right, mostly wrong in this comment. One, they're totally right that in medieval time, the Christian world treated Jews worse than the Islamic world, right? In almost every single case. So yes, the Crusades were terrible for Jews. The Crusades marched through Western Europe, through Central Europe, through Eastern Europe, all the way making it to the Promised Land, really killing and decimating any Jewish community that they came across. So anybody defending the Crusades, right, they are sort of beyond the pale. This doesn't mean that the Islamic world was something that we would consider good from any modern standard. This commentator is totally wrong when they say that dhimmi status was not something humiliating. Dhimmi status was actually purposely to be humiliating. We'll talk about a little bit of ways in a minute. They're also incorrect that the jizya tax, the tax that dhimmis had to pay, was significantly lower than the taxes that Muslims under the same rule were required to pay. I mean, does this pass, you at home, does this pass the sort of obvious test? Would an Islamic caliphate or an Islamic empire let Jews and by extension Christians pay a lower tax than Muslims, right? That seems to make no sense just on the face of it. I'll recommend, and I've mentioned both of these books on the podcast before. There's a book called Under Cross and Crescent by Mark Cohen. That's the picture in the bottom left, and he talks about interesting comparisons between Jews under Islamic and Jews under Christian rule, and he also talks a little bit about this history and the myth that things were perfect for Jews under Islamic rule. There's another book by Martin Gilbert called In Ishmael's House, and that's explicitly a history of Jews in Muslim lands. I highly recommend that you check out both of these books, and these are both written by well-trotted out historians as well. A couple of years ago, one of my students in my medieval Jewish philosophy class at the end, I'll give them a shout out because I think they listen to the podcast, John Paul and Donna, they got me this mug where it says, "What would Maimonides do?" And I like to keep this on my desk. This is usually what I'm drinking coffee out of during podcasts. And so many Jewish questions, I think, Maimonides, obviously the great Jewish, both legal scholar and philosopher, what might he say about this? Well, it's actually interesting because Moses Maimonides, who lived from 1838 to 1204, wrote a famous letter to the Jewish community in Yemen, who are being persecuted by the Muslim rulers there. And in his letter to Yemen, again, in the 1100s, he says, "You know, my brethren, that on account of our sins, God has cast us into the midst of this people, the nation of Ishmael, aka the Muslim world, who persecute us severely and who devise ways to harm us and to debase us. No nation has ever done more harm to Israel. None has been able to reduce us as they have." So Maimonides here is explicitly saying that the Islamic world has treated Jews worse than any other empire in the world. He's probably wrong about that from a factual perspective, but that was his experience. Maimonides, of course, growing up in the south of Spain, having to flee in the beginning of his life as a more radical sect of Islam took over the area. He then may have actually had to convert to Islam for a couple of years living in Fez, Morocco, because his life was at stake by, again, other radical Islamists, finally living out the rest of his life in Egypt, which was a more tolerable position for Jews to be in within the Islamic community there. And so, no, Jewish life in the Islamic world was not perfect. And on my next slide here, you can just read through a little bit of what dhimmi status meant. So I'll just go through a couple of these. One, there was a specific tax that Jews had to pay called the jizya. Jews were not allowed to carry any weapons, right? If you think about what, carrying weapons do, it allows people to be on equal footings of power, right? If all of your neighbors have weapons, but just one specific ethnic group is not allowed to have weapons. This is actually the case in America, where blacks were forbidden to have weapons for a long time because it creates a power imbalance between whites and blacks if you don't allow blacks to have any weapons, right? So Jews were in the same situation. Jews were not allowed to build new houses of worship or repair old ones without permission. So you want to build a new synagogue, you have to ask for new permission from the Islamic rulers. You're not allowed to have any public religious symbols. Jews are not allowed to proselytize, right? That was easy because Jews don't proselytize anyway, so that was mostly meant for the Christians there. Jews had to dress distinctively. A lot of people obviously know the yellow star from the Holocaust and the Nazis, but it was actually under dhimmi status in the Islamic world that Jews were forced to start to wear the yellow star. Again, you can look up the history of that. Jews were not allowed to ride horses, right? That was considered too honorable for Jews. They had to only ride on sort of lesser animals, mules and donkeys. Jews were not allowed to give testimony in court against Muslims, right? So you get into a fight or a argument or a legal discussion or debate with your Muslim neighbor under dhimmi status. The Jewish word was sort of assumed that the Muslim was correct. You can keep on going on. Jews had lower legal status. They were segregated in neighborhoods. There were areas that Jews couldn't buy property. There were humiliation rituals often when paying jizya in certain regions. And so this commentator, right, this is just such a misread of history. And as I've talked about on the podcast before, there are still academics and scholars of Jewish history that are still pushing this narrative that everything in the Islamic world was perfect until Zionism came along. Again, even if we don't think Maimonides is being completely historically accurate here, his own experience, and certainly the experience of the Jewish community in Yemen that he was writing these letters to, certainly understood that they were oppressed by the Islamic world. But I guess lived experience does not matter when Jews are involved.